The wagon wheels creaked beneath Sarah Mitchell as she stared at the endless prairie stretching before her. Dust clung to her black morning dress, turning the fabric gray in the relentless Dakota sun. 3 months had passed since the fever took her husband Thomas, 2 months since their infant daughter followed him into the ground. The grave she left behind in Independence, Missouri felt like the only real things in a world that had become nothing but shadows and whispers. God has a plan, the Reverend had told her at the funeral, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. Sarah had nodded then, believing the words even as her heart shattered. But now, bouncing along this desolate trail with strangers who barely spoke to her, she wondered what kind of God would strip away everything that made life worth living. What divine plan included burying your child before her first birthday? The wagon train had seemed like salvation when Mrs. Henderson from the church suggested it. A fresh start in the Oregon Territory, where land was cheap and opportunities abundant. Sarah had sold everything, the house Thomas built with his own hands, the furniture they picked out together, even her mother's silver candlesticks. She packed what remained of her life into a single trunk and joined 40 other souls heading west. That was before the cholera outbreak at Fort Laramie. Before the Johnsons lost both their sons in a single night. Before the wagon master, a gruff man named Carlisle, started making decisions based on speed rather than safety. They pushed harder each day, racing against the coming winter, leaving the sick behind with barely enough supplies to survive. Sarah watched it all with hollow eyes, too numb to feel shock anymore. She had stopped praying 2 weeks ago. The words felt empty, echoing in a void where God used to be. Every night she lay beneath the wagon, staring at stars that seemed as cold and distant as heaven itself. If God existed, he had turned his face away from her. Perhaps he had never been there at all. The other women in the train avoided her now. Widow's grief made people uncomfortable, as if loss might be contagious. Sarah didn't mind the isolation. It matched the wasteland inside her chest where love and faith once lived. She performed her duties mechanically, gathering buffalo chips for fuel, cooking her meager rations, walking beside the wagon to spare the oxen. But she moved through these tasks like a ghost, present but not truly alive. On the 37th day of travel, everything changed. Sarah was refilling her canteen at a creek when she heard the shouts. She looked up to see riders approaching from the north, at least 20 of them, moving with a fluid grace that made the wagon train's horses look clumsy by comparison. Her first thought was bandits, but as they drew closer, she recognized the beaded buckskin, the long dark hair, the painted horses. Lakota warriors. Panic erupted through the wagon train. Men scrambled for rifles while women gathered children close. Carlisle started barking orders, his face red with fury and fear. Sarah stood by the creek, canteen forgotten in her hand, and felt nothing. No fear, no hope, no prayer for deliverance. If death came riding on those magnificent horses, at least it would end this exhausting pretense of living. The warriors circled the wagons with practiced efficiency, and Sarah noticed something the others were too frightened to see. These men weren't attacking. Their weapons remained lowered, their postures alert but not aggressive. One rider separated from the group, moving forward with an authority that marked him as their leader. He was tall and broad-shouldered, sitting his horse with the ease of someone born in the saddle. Dark eyes scanned the wagon train, missing nothing, until they landed on Sarah standing alone by the creek. For a moment that stretched like honey in summer heat, their gazes locked. Something flickered in those dark depths, recognition, perhaps, though they had never met. Or maybe curiosity about the white woman who stood unafraid while others cowered. Carlisle stepped forward, rifle clutched across his chest, attempting to negotiate. But the Lakota Chief's eyes never left Sarah's face, and in that moment, something stirred in the frozen wasteland of her heart. Not hope, exactly. Not yet. But the faintest possibility that her story might not be over. The standoff lasted 3 heartbeats before the chief spoke, his English surprisingly clear despite a heavy accent. You cross Lakota land without permission. You hunt our buffalo, take our water. Why should we let you pass? Carlisle sputtered something about treaties and rights, waving papers that meant nothing out here on the endless grass. Sarah watched the exchange with detached interest, noting how the chief's jaw tightened at certain words, how his warriors shifted almost imperceptibly at perceived insults. These were not the savages Carlisle's bluster suggested. They were men protecting their home, and the wagon train was trespassing. The negotiation deteriorated quickly. Carlisle's voice grew louder, more demanding, while the chief's responses became shorter, colder. Sarah saw the moment when patience ended. The chief raised his hand, and instantly 20 warriors knocked arrows to bowstrings. The wagon train erupted in screams. Wait. Sarah's voice cut through the chaos, surprising herself as much as everyone else. She stepped forward, away from the dubious protection of the wagons, and walked toward the mounted warriors. Behind her, someone called her name in warning, but she ignored it. What did she have to lose? The chief watched her approach, his expression unreadable. Up close, she could see the fine craftsmanship of his clothing, the intelligence in his dark eyes, the old scar that traced his left cheekbone. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 30, with the bearing of someone who had earned respect rather than inherited it. "We are desperate people," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "We left everything behind for the promise of land and peace. We did not mean to offend by crossing your territory. We simply did not know a better way." The chief studied her for a long moment. "You speak truth while your leader speaks lies. Why is this?" "Because I have nothing left to protect," Sarah answered simply. "No husband, no child, no home. Only the truth remains." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes that suggested understanding. He spoke in Lakota to his warriors, and the terrible tension eased slightly. Then he looked back at Sarah. "I am Chaitin, chief of my band. You are widow?" "Sarah Mitchell." "Yes, I am widowed." "Then you understand loss." It was not a question. Chaitin gestured to his warriors. "We also know what it means to watch loved ones die, to have sacred lands taken, to wonder why the spirits allow suffering." The honesty of his words struck Sarah like a physical blow. She had been so consumed by her own grief that she had never considered that others might carry similar burdens. That perhaps suffering was not a sign of God's absence but simply the terrible cost of being alive. "We will let you pass," Chaitin announced, loud enough for the entire wagon train to hear. "But there is a price. You must leave gifts, food, blankets, tools. And one person must stay behind for 7 days, to learn our ways and carry back understanding." Carlyle immediately began protesting, but Sarah spoke over him. "I will stay." "No." Carlyle's face turned purple. "You can't just." "I volunteer," Sarah repeated firmly, looking only at Chaitin. "I will stay, learn your ways, and return to tell the others. It is fair payment for safe passage." Chaitin nodded slowly, respect flickering across his features. "You are brave for someone who claims to have nothing left." "Bravery implies I have something to fear," Sarah replied. "I assure you, I do not." The chief's lips quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Perhaps by the time 7 days pass, that will change. Come. Gather your belongings." The next hour passed in a blur. The wagon train unloaded supplies as tribute: flour, coffee, wool blankets, an iron kettle. Sarah retrieved her trunk, ignoring Mrs. Henderson's tearful warnings about savages and sin. Carlyle tried one last time to overrule her decision, but she simply walked past him toward the waiting warriors. Chaitin reached down from his horse, offering his arm. Sarah hesitated only a moment before grasping it, allowing him to pull her up behind him. The last thing she saw as they rode away was the wagon train shrinking to toy size against the vast prairie, carrying on without her toward a destination she no longer believed in. The Lakota camp appeared as they crested a low hill, a collection of teepees arranged in a careful circle beside a clear stream. Children ran between the dwellings while women worked on stretched hides and men tended horses. It looked, Sarah thought with surprise, like a community. Like a home. Chaitin helped her dismount, his hand steady at her elbow. "You will stay in my sister's teepee. She will teach you our customs. Do not fear, you will not be harmed here." "I am not afraid," Sarah said truthfully. Then, meeting his eyes, she added, "I am not anything at all." Chaitin regarded her with an expression that seemed to see straight through her skin to the empty place inside. "We will see," he said quietly. 7 days can be longer than you think." Sarah woke to unfamiliar sounds, the soft nickering of horses, children's laughter, the rhythmic scrape of tools on hide. Morning light filtered through the buffalo skin walls of the teepee, painting everything in warm amber tones. For a moment she forgot where she was, reaching instinctively for Thomas before memory returned like a knife between the ribs. "You are awake." The voice was gentle, feminine, speaking careful English. A woman about Sarah's age knelt nearby, stirring something over a small fire. Her face was kind, marked by the same high cheekbones and intelligent eyes as her brother. "I am Winona. Chaitin's sister." Sarah sat up slowly, aware that she had slept more deeply than any night since the fever took her family. "Thank you for sharing your home." Winona smiled. "Home is meant to be shared. Come, eat. Then I will show you our ways." The food was unfamiliar but delicious, a corn mush mixed with dried berries and nuts. Sarah ate mechanically at first, then with growing appreciation as hunger she had ignored for weeks suddenly roared to life. Winona watched with approval, refilling the wooden bowl twice before Sarah finally felt satisfied. "Your brother speaks English well," Sarah observed, grateful for conversation that required no emotional energy. "Missionaries came when we were young," Winona explained, her tone neutral. "They wanted to teach us their God, their language, their ways. Chaitan learned the words but kept our beliefs. He says it is wise to understand those who wish to change you." The comment carried layers Sarah was too tired to unpack. Instead, she asked, "Will you teach me about your beliefs?" Winona's eyes lit with pleasure. "I will teach you everything. But first, you must understand, our ways are not just words and prayers. They are how we live, how we see, how we belong to the earth and sky. Come." The days that followed unmade Sarah's understanding of the world. Winona taught her to identify edible plants, to read weather in cloud formations, to tan hides with a mixture of brain matter and patience. The work was hard, physical, demanding presence in a way that left no room for drowning in grief. Sarah's hands, soft from months of uselessness, developed calluses and strength. But it was not just the work that changed her. It was the community. Women gathered each afternoon to work together, their hands busy while conversation flowed like water. They spoke of practical things, which roots would ease fever, how to make winter moccasins, where the best chokecherries grew. But they also spoke of losses, of children who did not survive harsh winters, of husbands killed in battles with encroaching settlers, of sacred lands lost to treaties written in languages they could not read. Sarah listened, and something inside her began to crack. These women knew grief as intimately as she did, yet they still laughed. They still sang while they worked, still told stories that made children wide-eyed with wonder. Their losses had not made them hollow. Instead, they had woven their sorrow into the fabric of life, another thread in the pattern. On the fourth day, Chaitan approached her where she sat scraping a deer hide. "You learn quickly," he observed, settling onto the ground nearby with the casual grace that marked all his movements. "Your sister is a good teacher," Sarah replied, not looking up from her work. "She says you listen well. That you do not judge what is different, only seek to understand." He paused. "This is rare among your people." Sarah's hands stilled. "I have discovered that my people know very little about anything that matters." Strong words for someone who left everything to follow their path west. "I left because I had nothing left to lose. I followed because I had nowhere else to go." Sarah finally met his eyes. "I am beginning to think I was looking for the wrong things in the wrong places." Chaitan nodded slowly. "Winona told me you lost a husband and child. I also know this loss. My wife died bringing our son into the world 3 winters past. The child lived only 2 days." The revelation struck Sarah silent. She had assumed him unmarried, or perhaps widowed long ago. Not this recent wound, still raw beneath his calm exterior. "I am sorry," she whispered. "Sorrow is appropriate," Chaitan acknowledged. "But it must not become a prison. The spirits give us loss to teach us what cannot be learned through joy alone, that life is precious because it ends, that love matters because we can lose it, that we must choose each day whether to honor those who came before by living fully or dishonor them by refusing to continue." Tears pricked Sarah's eyes, the first she had allowed since burying her daughter. "How? How do you choose to continue when everything inside you is broken?" Chaitan reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and placed his hand over hers. The gesture was not romantic but deeply compassionate, one wounded soul acknowledging another. "You do not fix what is broken. You learn to carry it. And someday, if you are fortunate, you find that broken places can hold more love than whole ones ever could, because they understand the cost of what they hold." The words unlocked something in Sarah's chest that had been frozen since the moment she lowered her daughter into cold earth. She wept then, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body, while Chaitan sat beside her in silence, his hand steady on hers, bearing witness to a grief that had finally found release. The 6th day dawned clear and cool, autumn asserting itself across the prairie. Sarah woke before first light, unable to sleep as awareness pressed down on her chest. Tomorrow she would return to the wagon train. Tomorrow this unexpected sanctuary would end, and she would resume a journey toward a future she no longer believed in. She found Chaitan already awake, standing at the edge of camp watching the sun paint the eastern sky in shades of crimson and gold. He did not turn as she approached, but he shifted slightly, making room for her beside him. "I used to watch sunrises with my husband," Sarah said quietly. "We would sit on our porch with coffee, planning the day ahead. After he died, I could not bear to watch them anymore. They felt like a betrayal, the world continuing beautiful when it should have stopped in mourning. And now? Chaitan asked. Sarah considered the question honestly. Now I see that beauty and sorrow can exist together. That the sun rises whether we watch or not, and there is comfort in that certainty. Chaitan nodded. You have learned much in 6 days. Your sister is an excellent teacher. Your people are generous beyond anything I deserve. You deserve more than you believe. He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. Sarah Mitchell, I must speak plainly. Tomorrow you return to your people, to a path that leads away from everything you have found here. But it does not have to be this way. Sarah's heart began to pound. What do you mean? Stay, Chaitan said simply. Not as a guest for 7 days, but as one of us. Learn our language, our ways. Become part of this community that has already come to care for you. The offer hung in the air between them, enormous and impossible. Sarah's mind raced through 1,000 objections, the scandal, the impracticality, the vast cultural divide. But beneath the logical protests, something else stirred. A whisper that sounded like hope. I cannot simply abandon my own people, she said weakly. Why not? They abandoned you first, did they not? Left you alone in your grief, uncomfortable with your loss, rushing you toward a future you do not want. Chaitan's voice was gentle but relentless. The wagon train will continue without you. They do not need you, Sarah. But here, you could belong. Here, you could heal. You do not know me well enough to make such an offer, Sarah protested, even as her heart yearned toward the possibility he described. I know that you face fear without flinching. I know that you listen before judging, learn before condemning. I know that you carry your grief with dignity rather than bitterness. Chaitan stepped closer, his voice dropping. I know that when I look at you, I see someone who understands what it means to lose everything and still choose to stand each morning. That is enough. Sarah's breath caught. What exactly are you offering? A place among my people. A purpose beyond mere survival. He hesitated, vulnerability flickering across his strong features. And perhaps, in time, something more. I do not ask you to forget your husband or daughter. I ask only that you consider whether your story might have chapters yet unwritten. The words struck deep, resonating with something Sarah had been trying to articulate since her first night in the Lakota camp. She had been so focused on what she lost that she never considered what she might still find. The God she thought had abandoned her, perhaps he had not disappeared at all. Perhaps he had simply been waiting for her here, in this unexpected place, speaking through different voices in a language she was only beginning to understand. I need time to think, Sarah whispered. Of course. Chaitan stepped back, giving her space. But Sarah, think about what you want, not what you should want. Think about what would honor the love you carry, not what would simply avoid dishonouring it. There is a difference. He walked away then, leaving Sarah alone with the rising sun and a choice she never imagined making. Return to a wagon train full of people who had never truly seen her, continue toward Oregon and a future built on someone else's dream? Or stay here, among people who had welcomed her broken pieces without demanding she pretend to be whole? Sarah spent the day in a daze, mechanically helping Winona prepare food for the evening meal while her mind spun in circles. The Lakota women seemed to sense her turmoil, offering quiet support without demanding explanations. It was so different from the way grief was handled back home, where people either suffocated you with awkward sympathy or avoided you entirely. As sunset approached, old habits pulled Sarah toward the small rise where she had watched so many sunrises with Thomas. She sat in the prairie grass, letting memory wash over her, Thomas's laugh, her daughter's tiny hand curled around her finger, the life she had built and lost. For the first time, she did not push the memories away. Instead, she let them fill her completely, allowed herself to feel every moment of joy and every spike of loss. I miss you, she whispered to the empty air. I will always miss you. But I am so tired of merely existing. I want to live again. I want to wake up with purpose instead of dread. Is that betraying you? Or is it honoring the love you taught me by refusing to let it die with you? The wind stirred the grass, carrying the scent of sage and the distant sound of children playing. Sarah closed her eyes and listened, not for divine voices or mystical signs, but for the truth of her own heart beneath the layers of grief and obligation and fear. When she opened her eyes, Chaitan stood at the base of the hill, waiting. Not approaching, not demanding, simply present. Offering a future without promises or guarantees, only possibility. Sarah stood and walked down to meet him, Each step a choice, a commitment, a leap of faith into unknown territory. When she reached him, she did not hesitate. "I will stay," she said. "If the offer still stands, I will stay." 3 months later, Sarah knelt beside the stream where she had first stood watching Lakota warriors approach the wagon train. Ice formed delicate patterns along the edges where the current slowed, and her breath misted in the cold morning air. But she was warm in the fur-lined clothes Winona had helped her make, her hands steady as she broke through the ice to fill her water skin. The woman who completed this simple task bore little resemblance to the hollow-eyed widow who had volunteered to stay behind. Sarah's face had color now, sun-touched despite the advancing winter. Her hands were strong and capable, marked by calluses earned through useful work. Most remarkably, her eyes held light again, not the uncomplicated joy of someone who had never known loss, but the deeper radiance of someone who had walked through darkness and emerged changed but not defeated. "You think very loudly for someone trying to be quiet," Chaitan's voice came from behind her, warm with amusement. Sarah smiled without turning. "I was remembering the first time I stood here. How certain I was that nothing good could ever touch me again." Chaitan settled beside her, close enough that their shoulders brushed. Over the past months, they had grown comfortable with such casual contact, though both moved carefully, aware of the significance beneath each gesture. "And now I know that good and bad are not destinations but weather patterns. They come and go, sometimes gentle, sometimes devastating, but always changing." Sarah finally looked at him. "You taught me that. The world taught you. I simply helped you notice." Chaitan reached for her hand, his touch still tentative despite the months of growing closeness. "Sarah, I must speak with you about something important." Her heart quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "I am listening. Winter deepens, and soon the heavy snows will come. My people will gather in the sheltered valley where we spend the coldest months." He paused, choosing words carefully. "I want you to come as my wife, not simply as a member of the community. I have waited to speak because I wanted you to heal first, to choose from wholeness rather than desperation." Sarah's breath caught. She had known this moment was approaching, felt it in the way Chaitan looked at her when he thought she was not watching, in the careful respect he showed while his eyes betrayed deeper feelings. But knowing it was coming did not make it less enormous. "I still love my first husband," she said quietly. "I will always carry him with me." "As I carry my first wife," Chaitan replied. "Our losses do not prevent us from loving again. They teach us how precious love is, how carefully it must be tended." He lifted her hand, pressing it against his chest where she could feel his heart beating strong and sure. "I do not ask you to forget your past. I ask you to build a future alongside mine. To choose each day to be present, to let your broken places heal without demanding they disappear entirely." Tears gathered in Sarah's eyes, but they were not the desperate, hollow tears of early grief. These were tears of recognition, of finding something she had stopped believing existed. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Chaitan pulled her close, and Sarah let herself be held, let herself feel safe in someone's arms again. Over his shoulder, she watched the sun climb higher, painting the frozen stream in shades of silver and gold. The beauty no longer felt like a betrayal. It felt like a promise. The wedding ceremony, held 3 days later, was nothing like Sarah's first marriage. No church, no white dress, no nervous pastor stumbling through familiar words. Instead, the entire community gathered in a circle as Chaitan's uncle, a spiritual leader whose weathered face held decades of wisdom, spoke in Lakota about the sacred nature of union. Winona translated quietly, tears of joy streaming down her face. Sarah wore a dress Winona had made, white buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork that had taken weeks to complete. Chaitan stood beside her in his finest clothing, his hair woven with eagle feathers, his expression solemn and tender. When the ceremony called for them to wrap themselves together in a single blanket, symbolizing their commitment to share one life, Sarah felt something settle deep in her chest. Not the giddy excitement of her first wedding, but a deeper certainty built on genuine understanding and hard-won wisdom. That night, lying beside her new husband in their teepee while winter wind whispered outside, Sarah finally allowed herself to fully acknowledge the transformation that had occurred. She had boarded a wagon train believing herself abandoned by God, convinced that suffering had no purpose and loss had no end. She had been wrong on both counts. God had not abandoned her. He had simply used a language she did not yet speak, sent messengers she had not been taught to recognize, offered redemption through paths she never imagined walking. The Lakota people, whom she had been raised to fear as savages, had shown her more genuine compassion and spiritual truth than any church congregation back home. What are you thinking? Chaitan asked, his arm warm around her shoulders. That I spent so long looking for God in familiar places that I almost missed him when he appeared in an unexpected form. Sarah turned to face him in the darkness. That everything I thought I knew about faith and love and purpose was too small, too limited. You expanded my world when I thought it had ended. Chaitan kissed her forehead gently. You expanded yourself. I simply created space for you to grow. Outside, snow began to fall in earnest, the first heavy storm of winter. Sarah listened to it whisper against the teepee walls and felt perfectly at peace. Tomorrow she would wake beside this man who had taught her that broken hearts could love again. She would help Winona prepare food for the community feast. She would continue learning Lakota, stumbling over words while children giggled at her pronunciation. She would live a life she never planned, among people she was taught to fear, and she would be genuinely happy. The woman who boarded that wagon train in black mourning clothes no longer existed. She had not been replaced, exactly, but transformed, refined by loss, expanded by experience, remade by love she had not sought but desperately needed. Sarah Mitchell had thought God abandoned her when he took her family. She had been wrong. He had been preparing her for a different story entirely, one that required her to lose everything she thought mattered before she could discover what actually did. As sleep pulled her under, Sarah's last conscious thought was a prayer, not desperate or demanding, but simply grateful. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I gave up on you. Thank you for bringing me here, to this man, to this life. Thank you for teaching me that endings are sometimes just beginnings in disguise. Outside, the snow fell steadily, covering the prairie in white silence, transforming the landscape into something new while honoring everything that came before. And in the warm darkness of the teepee, two people who had learned the hard way that love is always a risk chose to take that risk together, building something beautiful from the broken pieces of their pasts. The end.